The first time she touched a real piano, she was 9 years old. It happened by accident. Her mother had taken her along to clean a wealthy family's house on the Upper East Side, and while her mother scrubbed bathroom tiles, the little girl wandered into a room she wasn't supposed to enter. There it was, a grand piano, black and shining, sitting in the middle of a sunlit room like it owned the place. She had seen pianos in movies before, but never one this close, never one she could touch. She looked around. Nobody was watching. Her small fingers pressed down on a single white key. The sound that came out made her heart jump. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She pressed another key, then another, and suddenly she understood something she couldn't put into words. This instrument could speak, and somehow, deep in her bones, she felt like she already knew its language. "What are you doing in here?" The voice made her spin around. The lady of the house stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face tight with anger. Her mother appeared seconds later, out of breath, apologizing over and over. They left that house early. Payment docked for the trouble. On the subway ride home, her mother didn't say a word. The little girl stared at her own hands, still feeling the ghost of those keys beneath her fingers. That night, lying on the mattress she shared with her 2 younger brothers in their tiny apartment above the family laundromat, she made herself a promise. One day, she would play the piano, not just touch it, play it. But promises are easy to make when you're 9. Keeping them is another thing entirely. Growing up in that part of the South Bronx, nobody talked about music lessons. People talked about paying rent. They talked about keeping the lights on. They talked about making sure there was enough food to stretch until the next paycheck. Her mother worked the laundromat from 6 in the morning until 10 at night, 7 days a week. Her father had left before her youngest brother was born. There was no extra money. There was barely enough money for what they needed. Piano lessons cost $40 an hour. That was groceries for a week. That was a phone bill. That was impossible. So she did what she could. She borrowed books from the library, old, yellowed books with titles like Piano Basics for Beginners and Understanding Music Theory. She studied the diagrams of keyboards, memorizing which keys made which notes. She learned to read sheet music the same way she learned to read English, slowly and stubbornly, refusing to give up, even when it made no sense. But reading about piano was not the same as playing it. Then, when she was 12, something changed. The community center 6 blocks from her apartment building got a donation. Someone had given them an old, upright piano, scratched and worn, with a few keys that stuck and a sound that was slightly out of tune. They put it in the corner of the main room, mostly for decoration. Nobody used it. Nobody. Except her. Every day after school, she walked those 6 blocks. She sat at that old piano and she practiced. At first, she just tried to match what she had learned in the books to actual sounds. Middle C, the major scale, simple nursery rhymes that she picked out note by note. The other kids at the community center thought she was strange. Why would anyone spend hours pressing the same keys over and over? But she didn't care what they thought. When she played, even badly, even stumbling through the simplest melodies, something inside her came alive. The noise of the neighborhood faded. Her worries about money and bills and her mother's tired eyes disappeared. There was only the music and her, together. Months passed. She got better. She learned to play songs all the way through without stopping. She figured out chords by listening to recordings and trying to copy what she heard. A volunteer at the community center noticed her dedication and gave her a stack of old classical music CDs that someone had donated. She took them home like they were treasure. At night, after her brothers fell asleep, she would put on headphones and listen. Chopin, Beethoven, Debussy. She had never heard anything so beautiful in her life. The music made her feel things she didn't have words for. It made her cry sometimes. And she didn't even know why. She wanted to play like that. She wanted it so badly. It hurt, but there was a problem. The community center closed at 7 o'clock. That wasn't enough time. She needed more hours. She needed a piano of her own. When she was 14, she found one. There was a music store on Tremont Avenue, a small, dusty place that sold used instruments. She walked past it every day on her way to school. One morning, she saw them dragging an old upright piano out to the curb. It was broken, they said. Not worth fixing. They were throwing it away. She stood there staring at it for so long that she almost missed first period. That afternoon, she begged her mother. Please, please let her bring it home. It was free. It was just sitting there on the street. She would find a way to fix it. She would do anything. Her mother looked at her daughter's face, at the desperate hope burning in her eyes, and she sighed. How are we going to get it up 4 flights of stairs? She asked. Together, the two of them dragged that broken piano from Tremont Avenue to their building. It took almost 4 hours. Neighbors came out to watch, some offering help, some just shaking their heads at the crazy woman and her crazy daughter trying to move a piano through the South Bronx. They got it up the stairs one step at a time. Her mother's hands were raw, and her own arms felt like they might fall off. The thing barely worked. Half the keys made no sound at all. The ones that did work were badly out of tune. But she didn't care. She practiced on it anyway, her fingers learning the movements, even when there was no music to hear. She would press the silent keys and hear the notes in her head, imagining what they should sound like based on what she had learned at the community center. People thought she was crazy. Maybe she was, but crazy was all she had. Years went by. She graduated high school. She got a job helping her mother at the laundromat. She never stopped practicing. She saved tips from customers, loose change, every extra dollar she could find. Slowly, she fixed her piano piece by piece. New hammers, new strings. A friend of a friend knew a guy who used to tune pianos, and he came by once a year and did it for cheap. By the time she was 25, that broken piano from the curb sounded almost beautiful. By the time she was 30, she could play Chopin's ballades from memory, but she had never performed for anyone except herself. She had never set foot in a concert hall. She had never even thought about it. Piano was her secret, her escape, the one thing in her life that belonged only to her. The idea of sharing it with strangers felt terrifying. Then one day, she saw a flyer taped to the window of a coffee shop. The Hartwell International Piano Competition. Open to amateur pianists of all backgrounds, all ages. No formal training required. She stood there, reading it 3 times to make sure she understood. No formal training required. The grand prize was money she could never dream of. But that wasn't what made her hands shake. What made her hands shake was the line at the bottom. Finalists will perform on a Steinway Model D concert, grand at Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall, a real Steinway. The kind of piano she had only ever seen in pictures. She took the flyer off the window. She carried it home. She sat at her old upright, the one she had dragged from the curb 16 years ago, and she played for hours. By midnight, she had made her decision. She was going to enter. She almost didn't send the application. 3 times she recorded her audition video, and 3 times she deleted it. The first take, her hands were shaking so badly, she hit wrong notes. The second take, a washing machine started its spin cycle halfway through and ruined the audio. The third take, she watched it back and thought she looked ridiculous. A grown woman in a laundromat, playing piano on an old upright that had been rescued from a curb. Who was she kidding? These competitions were for real musicians. People who had studied at famous schools. People who had played in recitals since they were children. People who belonged in that world. She was nobody. She was a laundromat worker from the South Bronx who had taught herself piano from library books and scratched CDs. But then she thought about all those years, all those hours, all those nights playing on silent keys while her brothers slept. If she didn't even try, what was it all for? On the last day before the deadline, she recorded one more video. This time, she didn't think about how she looked or whether the background was embarrassing. She just played. She played the piece she loved most, a Chopin ballade that she had learned note by note over 3 years. And she let herself disappear into the music the way she always did when she was alone. When she finished, she didn't watch it back. She just attached it to the application and hit send before she could change her mind. Then she went back to folding laundry and tried to forget she had done it. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived. She had been accepted into the preliminary round of the Hartwell International Piano Competition. The letter said she should report to the Hartwell Conservatory in Manhattan on the second weekend of October. It said she should prepare 2 contrasting pieces, one from the classical period and one from the romantic period. It said formal attire was required. She read the letter 4 times. Then she sat down on the floor of the laundromat and cried. Her mother found her like that, tears streaming down her face, the letter clutched in her hands. What happened? What's wrong? She couldn't speak. She just handed over the letter and watched her mother's face as she read it. Her mother's eyes went wide. Then, wet. Then she was crying too. And they were hugging each other right there between the dryers, laughing and sobbing at the same time. I told you. Her mother kept saying. I always told you. You have something special. I always knew. The next 2 months were the hardest of her life. She practiced 6 hours a day, sometimes more. She woke up at 4 in the morning to get her practice in before her shift at the laundromat. She played until her fingers ached and her back screamed and her eyes couldn't focus anymore. Then, she did it again, the next day. She had no teacher to guide her, no one to tell her if she was doing it right. She just had recordings and her own ears and a stubbornness that refused to quit. The formal attire requirement gave her trouble. She didn't own anything fancy. The nicest thing in her closet was a navy blue dress she had worn to her cousin's wedding 3 years ago. It was a little faded and not quite the right style, but it would have to do. She couldn't afford anything new. On the morning of the competition, she took the subway to Manhattan. She had printed out directions because her phone was old and the GPS didn't always work. The Hartwell Conservatory was in a part of the city she had never been to before. Quiet streets lined with trees, beautiful old buildings with columns and carved stone. She felt like she had stepped into another world. The conservatory itself took her breath away. It was massive, all marble floors and high ceilings and chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. There were paintings on the walls, portraits of famous musicians she had only ever read about. Everything smelled like old wood and money and history. She felt completely out of place. The other contestants moved through the halls like they owned them. They wore clothes that fit perfectly, expensive fabrics in muted colors. They carried themselves with a confidence that came from belonging, from knowing they had every right to be there. She heard them talking to each other. Casual conversations about their teachers and their summer programs and the competitions they had won before. One young man mentioned spending July at a music festival in Austria. A woman about her age talked about her master's degree from a conservatory in London. 2 teenagers discussed which pieces their private coaches had recommended for this competition. Private coaches. Master's degrees. She had learned piano in a laundromat. She found a quiet corner and tried to make herself invisible. Maybe if she didn't talk to anyone, no one would notice that she didn't belong. But then the orientation mixer happened, and hiding wasn't an option anymore. They gathered all the contestants in a grand reception room. There was wine and fancy little appetizers, and a lot of handshaking and networking. She stood near the wall, holding a glass of water, watching everyone else mingle and laugh and trade stories. She noticed him right away. An older man in an immaculate suit, silver hair swept back from his forehead, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers. People kept approaching him with nervous smiles and respectful nods. Even from across the room, she could tell he was important. She recognized him. His face had been on the covers of classical music magazines she had seen at the library. His recordings were some of the first she had ever listened to. He was Victor Ashford, one of the most famous pianists of his generation and the head judge of this competition. She had listened to his recording of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto so many times she had worn out the CD. Part of her wanted to run away. But another part, the stubborn part that had dragged a broken piano up 4 flights of stairs, told her to walk over there. This might be her only chance to meet someone like him. Maybe he would have advice. Maybe he would say something that would help her. She waited until the crowd around him thinned. Then she took a deep breath and approached. "Mr. Ashford." He turned. His eyes moved over her quickly, taking in her faded dress, her nervous posture, her lack of polish. "Yes?" His voice was polite, but distant. The kind of voice you use for someone who is wasting your time. "I just wanted to say that your recordings meant so much to me. I learned so much from listening to you play. It's an honor to meet you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How kind. And where did you study?" There it was. The question she had been dreading. "I'm self-taught," she said. "I learned on my own. At home." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Self-taught? No formal training at all?" "No, sir. I couldn't afford lessons. But I've been playing for over 20 years. I practiced every day. I learned from books and recordings. And where is home, exactly?" She hesitated. Something about his tone made her uncomfortable. But she had no reason to lie. Lie. Tremmed. Lie. "The South Bronx. My family runs a laundromat there. I actually learned to play on an old piano in the back room." The words had barely left her mouth when he laughed. Not a warm laugh. Not an encouraging laugh. A sharp, dismissive sound that made her stomach drop. "A laundromat," he repeated. He said it loudly, the way someone might announce an amusing joke. A few nearby contestants turned to look. How charmingly provincial. A self-taught pianist from a South Bronx laundromat. She felt her face grow hot. "I've worked very hard." "I'm sure you have, dear. I'm sure you have." His smile was thin and cold. "Tell me, do you at least know how to read music? Or will you be playing by ear? I do hope you're not planning to waste the judge's time with some folk melody you picked up between wash cycles." The people around them laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make her feel small. Enough to make her wish the marble floor would open up and swallow her whole. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. Her eyes were burning. Victor Ashford had already turned away, moving on to greet someone else, someone more worthy of his attention. She was forgotten. Dismissed. A joke he had already stopped thinking about. She left the reception room. She found a bathroom down the hall and locked herself in a stall and sat there with her hands pressed over her mouth so no one would hear her crying. 20 years. 20 years of work, of sacrifice, of dreaming. And in 30 seconds, he had made her feel like none of it mattered. Maybe he was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe this whole thing was a mistake. She sat in that bathroom stall for a long time, trying to decide whether to stay or go home. She stayed in that bathroom for almost an hour. The tears came and went in waves. Every time she thought she was done crying, she would remember the sound of his laughter, the way those people had looked at her, and it would start all over again. Her phone buzzed in her purse. A text from her mother. "How is it going? Are you having fun? I'm so proud of you." She stared at the message for a long time. Her mother had taken the day off work to cover her shift at the laundromat. Her mother, who never took days off, who worked until her hands cracked and her feet swelled, had insisted that today was special. Today her daughter was going to do something amazing. How could she tell her mother she wanted to quit? How could she go home and explain that some famous man had laughed at her and she had given up? After everything her mother had sacrificed, after all those years of support and belief and love, how could she walk away because of one cruel comment? But she couldn't stop hearing his voice. A laundromat. How charmingly provincial. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe passion and hard work weren't enough. Maybe there was something about real musicians, something taught in conservatories and summer programs and private lessons that she would never have. Some secret knowledge she had missed because she learned from library books instead of master teachers. She had been so proud of what she had accomplished. Now it all felt silly. A woman playing piano in a laundromat, dreaming about Carnegie Hall. What a joke. She wiped her face with toilet paper and tried to pull herself together. She needed to make a decision. Stay or go. Fight or surrender. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. Her mother had taken a picture of their old upright piano, the one they had dragged home from Tremont Avenue all those years ago. Underneath the photo was a message. This piano is waiting for you to come home a winner. But no matter what happens, you already won. You made it further than anyone thought possible. I love you. Mija. She looked at that photo for a long time. The scratched wood, the yellowed keys, the small chip on the corner from when they had bumped it against the stairway, railing trying to get it up to the 4th floor. That piano had been thrown away. Someone had decided it was worthless, broken, not worth saving. But she had seen something in it. She had worked on it, fixed it, loved it, and turned it into something beautiful. Maybe that's what Victor Ashford saw when he looked at her. Something broken. Something not worth saving. Something to throw away. But he was wrong about that piano. And maybe he was wrong about her too. She stood up. She washed her face in the sink. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were red and puffy. Her makeup was ruined. She looked like a mess. But underneath the mess, she was still the same person who had practiced for 20 years. Still the same person who had taught herself to play Chopin on silent keys. Still the same person who refused to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier. One man's opinion didn't change any of that. She fixed her makeup as best she could. She straightened her faded dress. She took a deep breath. Then she walked out of that bathroom and went back to the competition. The next few days were brutal. The preliminary rounds were held in a large recital hall inside the conservatory. Each contestant had 15 minutes to perform. The judges sat at a long table in the front row, taking notes, their faces revealing nothing. Victor Ashford was always in the center seat. Every time she saw him, her stomach tightened. But she refused to let him see that he had gotten to her. She kept her head up. She didn't avoid his gaze. She acted like their conversation at the mixer had never happened. She watched the other contestants perform. They were good. Really good. Their technique was flawless, their fingers moving over the keys with a precision that came from years of professional training. They played complicated passages without a single mistake. They had been taught by the best teachers in the world, and it showed. For a moment, the doubt crept back in. How could she compete with this? These people had spent their whole lives preparing. They had every advantage. She had nothing but stubbornness and a dream. But then she noticed something. Some of these perfect performances left her feeling cold. The notes were all correct. The timing was exact. But something was missing. It was like listening to a machine, technically impressive, but empty somehow. She thought about why she had learned to play in the first place. Not for competitions, not for fame, not to impress anyone. She had learned because the music made her feel something. Because when she played, she could express things she couldn't put into words. Because the piano had saved her during the hardest years of her life. Maybe that was worth something. Maybe that was the one thing they couldn't teach in conservatories. The night before her preliminary performance, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her hotel room, a cheap place she had found 20 blocks from the conservatory because it was all she could afford, and stared at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, working alone at the laundromat right now. She thought about her brothers, who had texted her good luck messages, even though they didn't really understand what she was doing. She thought about all the customers at the laundromat who had heard her practicing over the years. who had told her she should do something with her talent, who had believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. She thought about that 9-year-old girl who had wandered into a forbidden room and touched a piano for the first time. That girl had made a promise. And tomorrow, that promise would either come true or break forever. At some point, she must have fallen asleep, because suddenly her alarm was going off, and sunlight was streaming through the thin curtains. Her hands were shaking as she got dressed. They were still shaking as she took the subway to the conservatory. They were still shaking as she sat in the waiting area outside the recital hall, listening to the contestant before her play. A technically perfect Mozart sonata. Then they called her name. She stood up. Her legs felt like they might give out. The walk to the stage seemed to take forever. The recital hall was smaller than she had expected. Maybe 50 seats, most of them empty. Just the judges, a few staff members, and a handful of other contestants who had come to watch. Victor Ashford sat in his usual spot, center of the judges' table. He was looking at a sheet of paper, probably her application. She saw his lips curve into a small smirk. He remembered her. Of course he did. The piano was a Steinway. Not a concert grand, but beautiful nonetheless. Black and gleaming under the stage lights. The most expensive instrument she had ever been allowed to touch. She sat down on the bench. She adjusted the height, the way she had read you were supposed to. She placed her hands on the keys, and for a moment, her mind went completely blank. She couldn't remember how her piece started. She couldn't remember anything. All she could feel was the weight of the judge's eyes on her, the pressure of the moment, the fear of failure crushing her chest. Then she closed her eyes. She thought about the laundromat, the sound of the machines, the smell of detergent, the feeling of coming home after a long day and sitting down at her old upright piano, the way the music had always been there for her, like a friend who never judged, never criticized, never made her feel small. She wasn't playing for Victor Ashford. She wasn't playing for the judges, or the competition, or anyone else in this room. She was playing for that little girl who had made a promise. She was playing for her mother, who had never stopped believing. She was playing for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. They didn't belong. They should just give up. She opened her eyes, and she began to play. The first note filled the room like a heartbeat. She had chosen to play Chopin's Ballade, No. 1-inch G minor. It was the piece she knew better than any other. The one she had spent 3 years learning note by note from a scratched CD, borrowed from the library. She had played it so many times that it had become part of her, woven into her muscles and bones and blood. The opening was soft, almost hesitant. A simple melody that seemed to ask a question. Her fingers moved over the keys gently, feeling their way into the music like someone stepping into a familiar room after a long time away. She forgot about the judges. She forgot about Victor Ashford and his smirk. She forgot about the other contestants and their fancy degrees and their summers in Austria. She forgot about everything except the piano beneath her hands and the story she was telling. Because that's what this piece was. A story. Chopin had written it almost 200 years ago, but it was still alive. It was about longing and loss and hope and heartbreak. It was about fighting against something bigger than yourself and refusing to surrender even when surrender would be easier. She understood that story. She had lived it. The melody grew stronger. The questions in the opening became statements. Her fingers moved faster now, dancing across the keys with a confidence that surprised even her. She wasn't thinking about technique or finger placement or any of the things the books had taught her. She was just feeling. She was letting the music move through her like water through a river. In the audience, something shifted. The few people who had been watching with polite disinterest began to sit up straighter. One of the judges stopped writing and just listened. Even Victor Ashford's smirk faded into something else, something harder to read. She didn't notice any of this. She was somewhere else now, somewhere the music had taken her. She thought about her mother. The way her hands looked after a 12-hour shift. Red, and rough from folding other people's clothes. The way she never complained, never asked for anything, never stopped working. The way she had helped drag that broken piano up 4 flights of stairs without ever questioning why her daughter needed it so badly. The music swelled. A passionate theme emerged, full of yearning and defiance. Her hands flew across the keyboard, pulling sounds from the instrument that she didn't even know she was capable of making. The Steinway responded to her touch like a living thing, giving her more than she asked for, matching her emotion with its own voice. She thought about all the nights she had practiced on silent keys, all the times she had pressed down on broken hammers and heard the music only in her head, all the times she had wanted to quit, wanted to give up, wanted to accept that some dreams were just too big for people like her. But she never did. She never stopped. And now here she was, playing on a Steinway in a room full of people who had been told their whole lives that they were special, that they belonged, that the world of music was theirs by right. She didn't belong here. Everyone knew it. She knew it herself. But the music didn't care about belonging. The music only cared about truth. The ballade moved into its turbulent middle section. This was the hardest part. Technically, rapid passages that required precision and strength, complicated rhythms that could trip up even experienced pianists. She had practiced this section thousands of times, but she had never played it on an instrument this responsive, this alive. Her fingers stumbled. Just slightly. A note that wasn't quite clean. A transition that wasn't quite smooth. She felt her heart lurch. This was it. This was where everything would fall apart. This was where they would see that she was just a pretender, a laundromat girl who had no business touching a Steinway. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The music wouldn't let her. She pushed through the stumble like it was a wave she had to swim through. She found her footing again. And somehow, impossibly, the imperfection made the performance more real. It reminded everyone listening that this wasn't a recording, wasn't a machine. This was a human being, pouring her heart out through her fingers. The music softened again. A tender passage, almost like a lullaby. She thought about her little brothers, how she used to play quiet songs for them when they couldn't sleep. Back when the piano still had more broken keys than working ones. She thought about the community center, the old upright in the corner, the volunteer who had given her those classical CDs that changed her life. She thought about every person who had ever helped her along the way. The neighbor who had loaned them a dolly to move the piano. The library clerk who had ordered extra music books because he noticed how often she came in. The customers at the laundromat who had listened to her practice and told her she had a gift. None of those people were here today. None of them would ever set foot in a place like the Hartwell Conservatory. But she was carrying them with her. All of them. Every act of kindness. Every word of encouragement. Every small moment of grace that had kept her going when giving up would have been so much easier. The final section of the ballade began. This was the storm. The climax. Everything building toward a conclusion that was both triumphant and tragic. Her hands moved like they had a mind of their own. Years of practice had prepared her for this moment. But it wasn't just practice anymore. It was everything she had ever felt and everything she had ever been. It was anger at all the people who had doubted her and gratitude for all the people who had believed. It was the pain of being poor and the joy of making beauty anyway. It was loss and hope and love and fear, all mixed together, all coming out through her fingers onto the keys. The room was completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. She built toward the final passages. The music grew louder, more intense, more demanding. Her whole body was involved now, not just her hands. She was swaying with the rhythm, leaning into the powerful chords, feeling the vibrations of the instrument move through her chest. And then, the ending. The famous ending that she had listened to 100 times, trying to understand how Chopin could put so much emotion into a handful of notes. A crashing, devastating conclusion that felt like a door slamming shut on everything that came before. She played the final chord. She held it. She let the sound ring out until it faded into nothing. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. She sat there for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She didn't know if what she had just done was good or bad. She didn't know if she had succeeded or failed. She only knew that she had given everything she had. Every ounce of herself was now out there in the room, exposed and vulnerable. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the piano. She stood up from the bench. She turned to face the judges. Victor Ashford was staring at her. His face was unreadable. The other judges were looking at each other, exchanging glances she couldn't interpret. And then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started clapping. It was one of the other contestants, a young woman who had performed earlier that day, a graduate of Juilliard, with perfect technique and an impressive list of awards. She was standing up, her hands coming together in applause. Then another person joined, and another. And suddenly everyone in the room was standing, everyone was clapping, and the small recital hall was filled with a sound she had never expected to hear. A standing ovation. For her. The laundromat girl. The self-taught pianist. The nobody who didn't belong. She felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to hide them. She just stood there, taking it in, letting herself believe for the first time that maybe, just maybe she did belong here after all. The days after her performance passed in a blur. She went back to the laundromat and worked her shifts like nothing had happened. Customers came and went, washing machines hummed and spun, and she folded clothes and made change and tried not to think too much about what was coming next. But at night, alone in her room, she would replay the memory of that standing ovation over and over. The sound of the applause, the faces of the people who had stood up for her. The tears, she couldn't stop. Part of her still didn't believe it had really happened. A week later, the email arrived. She had made it through the preliminary round. She was one of 12 finalists who would compete in the final round at the main concert hall. The email said the finals would be open to the public. It said there would be hundreds of people in the audience. It said the winner would receive a cash prize and a chance to record with a major classical music label. She read the email 3 times. Then she called her mother. Her mother screamed so loud that she had to hold the phone away from her ear. In the background, she could hear her brothers asking what was going on, and then they were screaming too. And soon the whole laundromat was celebrating, even though most of the customers had no idea what they were celebrating about. The finals were held 3 weeks later. This time, she didn't take the subway alone. Her mother closed the laundromat for the first time in 15 years. Her brothers took the day off work. Even a few regular customers showed up. People who had listened to her practice over the years and wanted to see her big moment. They filled an entire row near the back of the concert hall. Her own little cheering section, dressed in their best clothes, looking around at the fancy venue with wide eyes. They didn't belong here any more than she did. But they had come anyway, because they loved her. The concert hall was beautiful. High ceilings painted with angels and clouds. Velvet seats in deep red. A massive crystal chandelier that sparkled like 1,000 stars. And on the stage, under a spotlight, the most gorgeous piano she had ever seen. A Steinway Model D Concert Grand. The same kind of piano, played by the greatest musicians in history. She was going to play that piano. In front of all these people. The thought made her dizzy. The other finalists were impressive. Conservatory graduates, competition veterans. Young prodigies who had been groomed for this moment since childhood. They played with technical perfection that made her feel like a beginner. Every note in place. Every phrase, polished to a shine. She watched from backstage, her stomach tight with nerves. How could she compete with this? These people had spent their whole lives preparing. They had every advantage. What did she have? Then she remembered what her mother had told her the night before. You're not competing against them. her mother had said. "You're just telling your story. Nobody else can tell that story. It belongs only to you." When they called her name, she walked onto that stage with her head held high. She could see her family in the back row, her mother already crying, her brothers giving her thumbs up. She could see Victor Ashford in the front row, his face as cold and unreadable as ever. She sat down at the Steinway. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling their smoothness, their perfect weight. This instrument was worth more than everything she had ever owned combined. It was made for hands like hers, even if people like Victor Ashford would never believe that. She had chosen a different piece for the finals. Something even more personal. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, third movement. A piece that started soft and haunting before exploding into one of the most demanding technical passages in all of piano music. It was a risk. But she had never gotten anywhere in life by playing it safe. She took a deep breath, she closed her eyes, and she began. The opening notes were gentle, almost like a whisper. The audience leaned in, drawn by the tenderness of the sound. She let the melody breathe, gave it space, treated each note like something precious. Then the storm came. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and power that surprised even her. The concert grand responded with a voice that filled every corner of the hall. It was like the piano had been waiting its whole life for someone to play it like this. Every note rang out clear and true, echoing off the painted ceiling, surrounding the audience in a wall of sound. She played the way she had always played. Not like someone trying to be perfect. Like someone who had something to say. The music poured out of her. All her pain and hope and love and anger. Everything she had carried for 32 years. Everything she had never been able to put into words. In the front row, something unexpected happened. Victor Ashford's expression changed. The coldness melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like surprise. His eyes, which had always seemed to look down on her, were now just looking. Watching. Listening. For the first time, he was actually hearing her. The piece built toward its final climax. Her hands were moving so fast, they were almost a blur. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Every muscle in her body was engaged, pushing toward the conclusion. And then, the final chord. Loud and triumphant and absolute. She lifted her hands from the keys. The last note faded into silence. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the audience erupted. The applause was deafening. People were standing, shouting, some of them crying. In the back row, her mother was sobbing into her hands while her brothers hugged her from both sides. The regular customers from the laundromat were cheering like they were at a football game. She stood up and bowed, tears streaming down her face. This was more than she had ever dreamed, more than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. She didn't win first place. That honor went to a young man from Germany who had been trained at one of the finest conservatories in Europe. His technique was flawless, his interpretation intelligent and refined. He deserved the prize. But when the judges announced a special recognition award created specifically for this competition, they called her name. She walked back onto the stage in a daze. The head of the judging panel, an older woman with kind eyes, handed her a small trophy and an envelope. "This award," the woman said into the microphone, "is for the performer who most moved us, whose music reminded us why we fell in love with piano in the first place, whose story proves that talent can bloom anywhere, even in the most unlikely places." She looked down at the trophy in her hands. It was small and simple, nothing like the grand prize. But it meant more to her than any first-place trophy ever could. Backstage, after the ceremony, she was gathering her things when she heard a voice behind her. That was quite a performance. She turned around. Victor Ashford was standing there, his hands clasped in front of him. His face was different than before. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like respect. She didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. What I said at the mixer was cruel and unfair. I judged you based on where you came from, instead of what you could do. That was wrong. She stared at him. Of all the things she had expected from this competition, this was not one of them. I've been teaching and judging for 40 years, he continued. I thought I knew what a real musician looked like. You proved me wrong. What you have cannot be taught in any conservatory. It can only be lived. He extended his hand. She shook it. I hope you keep playing, he said. The world needs to hear your story. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her trophy and her thoughts. A year later, she released her first album. She recorded it on a Steinway Grand, in a real studio, with professional sound engineers. The cover showed a photograph of her sitting at her old upright piano in the laundromat, the washing machines visible in the background. She dedicated the album to her mother, and to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The album sold more copies than anyone expected. Critics called her playing raw and emotional and deeply human. They said she reminded them why music mattered. She used the money to buy her mother a house with a big sunny room just for the piano. A real piano this time, with all 88 keys working perfectly. Her mother cried when she saw it. Sometimes, late at night, she still goes back to the laundromat. She sits at her old upright, the one she dragged home from the curb when she was 14, and she plays, not for fame, not for money, not to prove anything to anyone, just because the music lives in her, and it always will.